At the heart of a crumbling family empire, an elderly woman watches as her own children betray her for wealth and power. Desperately neglected and manipulated, she must decide whether to fight back or let go. But when the truth about her hidden strength is revealed, the battle for honor and revenge takes an unexpected turn. Can she reclaim her dignity and restore the broken bonds, or will the very family she loved destroy her forever? What will she sacrifice to regain control? The storm had long since passed, leaving the streets of Ashford damp and glistening in the early morning light. It was on days like this, when the clouds were still hanging low over the horizon, that Helen Graves would walk the quiet streets, lost in her own thoughts. The people of Ashford knew her well. Everyone did. She was the widow, the old woman who lived alone in the large, crumbling mansion at the edge of town. Some of the younger folk found her strange, but those who had been around long enough respected her. After all, she was a woman of history, a woman who had once been at the center of the town's most influential circles. But today Helen Graves was a different kind of widow. One who had, at last, seen through the veils of illusion her family had so carefully spun around her. One who had borne witness to the slow unraveling of the life she had known, and was now ready to face the consequences of the many years she had spent in neglect and silence. Helen had always been a woman of dignity, her eyes sharp beneath the soft silver curls of her hair. Yet for the past several years, that dignity had been worn thin by the treatment she had received at the hands of her own children. They had reduced her to nothing more than an afterthought, a relic of a past they could no longer be bothered to acknowledge. A woman who had once ruled over her home with grace and strength had become a shadow of herself, fading away in the corners of the mansion that no one seemed to care for anymore. Her life had been a constant struggle to prove that she was still capable, still powerful. But as time passed, even Helen had begun to doubt her own strength. It was hard to feel anything other than small when the world around you seemed to shrink with every passing day. It wasn't just the neglect that wore her down. It was the quiet way her children, Jack, Emily, and Sophie, had shifted their focus from her to the future, to their inheritance. They had been indifferent to her needs, more interested in the value of her home and the wealth left behind by her late husband, Charles Graves, than in the woman who had given birth to them and raised them with love. Charles had been the man who held the family's wealth, but it was Helen who had maintained the delicate balance of power in their home. He had been the one who had made the money, built the empire that had supported them all, but it was Helen who had made the decisions, who had been the backbone of their social life. She was the one who had negotiated the delicate relationships with the townspeople, and she had done it with an elegance that no one could deny. But now, after Charles's sudden death, all of that had crumbled. She was no longer the respected matriarch of the family. She had become a mere bystander, ignored and pushed aside. The day Charles had passed had been the moment everything changed. The doctors had said it was a heart attack, sudden and without warning. A death that had come too soon, leaving a void that no one knew how to fill. Helen had stood at his bedside, holding his hand, watching as he slipped away from her grasp. The funeral had been grand, just as Charles would have wanted, but Helen's grief had been swallowed by the empty halls of their mansion. It was at that funeral, just as the crowd was beginning to disperse, that two men in dark suits had approached her. They were lawyers, men she had never met before, yet they knew her name and addressed her with a level of familiarity that made her uneasy. They handed her a small envelope, sealed with a wax emblem that seemed out of place in the modern world. The moment she saw the name on the envelope, Helen's heart skipped a beat. It was from Charles. A final message, a final gesture of control from the man who had once dominated her life. The letter inside had been short but to the point. It explained that the estate, the mansion, and all of their wealth had been left in her care. But there was something more, something that made her stomach tighten. A clause that stated her children would inherit everything once she passed away, but only if they could prove themselves worthy. Helen had read the letter twice, then again. The last line stuck in her mind like a blade. In the event that you are unable to manage the estate, my children will assume control. But be warned, Helen. There are forces beyond your understanding. Forces that you have yet to see. She had asked the lawyers for an explanation, but they merely shrugged, looking at each other with silent complicity. They had handed her the documents and left, leaving her alone with the weight of her husband's words. That evening, Helen sat by the window staring out at the mansion's sprawling grounds. It was a grand estate, but it was beginning to feel like a prison. Her children had already begun to act differently toward her, their kindness replaced with quiet impatience. Jack, her eldest son, had already begun making plans to sell the property. Emily, her once loving daughter, no longer visited as often. Only Sophie, the youngest, still seemed to care, but Helen could sense the growing distance between them as well. Helen had always been the type to stay silent in the face of conflict. She had learned long ago that sometimes it was better to let others speak for you. But in the solitude of her study, surrounded by the things she had carefully curated over the years, Helen began to realize that silence no longer served her. The first signs of rebellion came 1 week later, when Jack asked if she would sign over the rights to the mansion so that they could sell it. He was quick to point out that, at her age, it would be better for her to move into a smaller home, one that would be easier for them to maintain. Helen had refused. She could feel the tension building in the room as Jack's face tightened, his words turning sharper. "You know, it makes sense, Mom. You can't keep living in this big house all alone. Think of the cost. Think of the future." Helen had looked him straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "This house has stood for over 100 years. She said, her voice low but firm. "It will stand long after you're gone." Jack had left the room, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and frustration. Helen had known that this was just the beginning. They would push her, try to take what was rightfully hers. But she was no longer the quiet woman they had known. She would fight for what she had left, for the legacy she had built.
Helen Graves had always been a woman who valued control. She had run her home with an iron will, ensuring that her family's affairs were well maintained, that her children knew their place, and that the world around her remained orderly. But in the weeks following Charles's death, it became increasingly clear that control was slipping through her fingers like sand. What had once been a well-oiled machine, her family, was now a chaotic mess of greed, ambition, and resentment. Jack, her eldest son, had been the first to show his true colors. Helen had expected some grief, some sadness, but Jack seemed more interested in the business of death than in mourning his father. He was already making plans for the estate, talking about the renovations that would need to be done and the property that could be sold. His words were wrapped in concern for her well-being, but his tone betrayed his true intent. The mansion, it seemed, was now just another piece of property to him. Something to be liquidated, something to be turned into profit. Every time he visited, his conversations steered toward the house, the land, the inheritance. And when he wasn't talking about money, he was questioning her judgment. "Mom, I'm just saying," Jack had said one afternoon as he sat across from her at the dinner table, his voice casual but pointed, "this place is a lot for you to manage on your own. Maybe we should look into selling the property and investing in something smaller, more manageable. You don't need this burden." Helen had glanced at him over the rim of her glass. His words stung, but she had learned long ago not to show weakness. "I've managed just fine for the past 40 years, Jack," she replied, her voice steady. "I think I can manage a little longer." But Jack's eyes had narrowed, his patience wearing thin. "I just don't think you get it, Mom. The house, the estate, it's a lot. We can't just keep it forever. It's a lot of money tied up in this place." That night, after Jack left, Helen had stood in the vast, echoing hallways of the mansion, her fingers trailing along the walls that had witnessed decades of memories. Every inch of the house held a piece of her past, from the grand staircase to the old piano that Charles used to play. The mansion was more than just a house to her. It was her legacy, the only thing she had left. She would not let it go. Yet, despite her defiance, she knew that Jack wasn't the only one who had an interest in her wealth. Emily, her daughter, had been quiet during the funeral, the wake, and the following weeks. Too quiet. She had always been the more reserved of the two, and for a long time Helen had admired Emily's calm demeanor. But lately she had noticed a shift in her behavior. Emily's visits had become less frequent, and when she did come she seemed distracted, lost in her own thoughts. Helen caught her one day sitting on the couch in the study fiddling with her phone. When Emily noticed her, she quickly put the phone away, but Helen had already seen the notification on the screen. It was from a local real estate agent. Helen didn't need to ask what was going on. Her daughter, like her son, was thinking about the future. Her future. The mansion, the inheritance, it was all starting to take shape in her mind. One morning, while the rain tapped gently against the windows, Helen had a conversation with Sophie, her youngest daughter. Sophie had always been the more affectionate of the three, the one who still called her frequently to check in, the one who seemed to genuinely care. But even Sophie, it seemed, had her own motives. "I've been talking to Jack," Sophie said one afternoon, her voice quiet as she sipped tea across from her mother. "And I think we need to consider the bigger picture here. It's not just about the house, Mom. It's about the future. About making sure everything goes to the right place." Helen's heart tightened. She had always trusted Sophie more than the others, had believed that her daughter's love for her was pure. But now it seemed even Sophie was being pulled into the current of greed that was rapidly consuming the family. "I'm not selling," Helen replied, her voice firm, but Sophie's response was softer, more insidious. "I'm not saying sell, Mom. But maybe it's time we talked about your future. About what's best for you." Sophie's eyes, so full of kindness in the past, now seemed calculating. She was no longer the girl who ran to her for comfort. She had her own interests in mind now, and they didn't involve Helen's well-being. Helen sat back in her chair, trying to gather her thoughts. Sophie wasn't the only one who had been changing. Everyone around her was transforming, becoming something she no longer recognized. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about control. It was about power. And they were all playing the same game with the same stakes. But it wasn't just the children who had begun to turn on her. The neighbors, too, had started treating her differently. Helen had always been the matriarch of Ashford, a woman everyone respected. But now she found herself on the receiving end of pitying looks, condescending smiles, and thinly veiled whispers. Her decline had become entertainment for some, a story for others. They no longer saw her as a force to be reckoned with. She was a relic, something to be cast aside in the name of progress. It was at one of the local gatherings that the full extent of her family's betrayal hit her. The town had gathered for a charity event, an annual affair that Charles had always been proud to host. As Helen entered the ballroom, the room seemed to fall silent for just a moment, before a murmur of conversation picked up again. She felt the eyes on her, felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere as she walked toward the refreshment table. There, standing in a huddle, were her children, Jack, Emily, and Sophie. They weren't talking to her. They weren't even acknowledging her presence. Instead, they were engaged in a whispered conversation that she could barely hear, but the words mansion and cell floated through the air. Helen's chest tightened. She had never felt more alone in her life. She was surrounded by her own flesh and blood, but there was no warmth, no connection. Just cold calculations, each of them jockeying for position in the battle for what was hers. The night dragged on, but Helen found it harder and harder to engage with anyone. Every word she spoke felt like a plea, every gesture a cry for recognition. But no one cared. No one noticed. She was fading away, and they were moving forward without her, leaving her behind to watch. As Helen left the event early, stepping out into the cold night air, she realized that she had been wrong all along. She had thought that love was enough to hold her family together, but now she saw that love had never been the issue. Power had always been the driving force. Power and the control that came with it. Helen couldn't wait any longer. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. It was time for her to take back control. It was time for her to remind her family of the woman they had once known. And so, with the cold wind at her back, she made a decision that would change everything. She would stop being the passive widow, the neglected old woman. She would take back what was hers, and this time there would be no holding back.
The days following Helen's quiet decision felt like the calm before a storm. She had always been a woman of action, and now she had chosen to move with purpose. No longer would she be content to be a bystander in her own life. As the rain continued to fall relentlessly outside, so did the weight of her thoughts. Helen had known this day would come. The day when her children would begin to see her not as their mother, but as a means to an end. But now, with clarity, she understood that this was more than just a family dispute. This was about the future of her legacy. Her family's inheritance. And it was time for her to reclaim it. She spent the next several days in the study, her refuge from the noise of the world outside. It was here that she could think clearly, away from the whispers, the scheming, and the constant pull for her to give in. She had lived through far worse trials in her lifetime, but this felt different. This was not the world of her youth, the world of hard work and modest expectations. No, this was a world of wealth, status, and manipulation. It was a world she had fought her whole life to protect, and now, it was being torn from her by the very people she had raised. As she stared at the papers before her, a sense of unease crept up her spine. She had never been one to play dirty, to involve herself in the underhanded dealings that so many in her circle engaged in. But the stakes were different now. The inheritance, her husband's legacy, had become the new battleground. And if she wanted to protect it, to keep it from falling into the hands of those who would squander it, she had no choice but to fight fire with fire. The will, which had once been a symbol of her husband's love and trust, now felt like a weapon, something that could be used against her. Charles had left everything to her, but he had also left provisions for the children in the event of her passing. It was in those provisions that she saw the cracks in the foundation of their family. Charles had trusted that his children would be responsible, that they would uphold the family's honor, but Helen knew better. She knew their greed. Her first move was simple. She contacted her lawyer, a woman named Margaret Larson who had handled the family's affairs for years. Margaret was the kind of woman who could be trusted with such delicate matters. She had seen the darker sides of the Graves family, but she had always kept her distance. It was time to involve her. When Margaret arrived at the mansion, Helen could see the concern in her eyes. The lawyer had been one of the few who truly understood the weight of the estate, the power it held in their small community, and the importance of protecting it. But even Margaret couldn't hide her worry. "Are you sure about this, Helen?" Margaret asked, sitting across from her in the dimly lit study. "Once we make this move, there's no going back. This will change everything." Helen nodded, her eyes cold. "I have no choice. If I don't act now, my children will take everything. They'll sell the mansion, squander the money, and leave me with nothing." Margaret hesitated. "And what about your legacy? The mansion, it's everything. Are you prepared to let go of that?" Helen's grip tightened on the papers in front of her. "I'm not prepared to let go of anything. I've spent my life building this, and I won't let anyone take it from me." Margaret sighed, but there was a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "All right, we'll begin the process. But I need you to understand that once you make your move, there will be no turning back. Your children will be furious." Helen stared out the window, her reflection merging with the storm outside. "They'll be furious no matter what. They're already angry with me." That night, as she prepared to make her first move, Helen found herself standing in front of the grand mirror that had always adorned the hallway. The mirror was old, one of the few things that had survived from Charles's family, and Helen had always viewed it as a symbol of the life they had built together. But tonight it felt like a reminder of everything she stood to lose. Her fingers traced the frame, and for a moment she was lost in the memories. She saw Charles, young and vibrant, standing beside her. She saw the children, so small in those days, full of laughter and joy. And then the memory shifted. She saw them grown, the tension between them evident even then, long before the inheritance had become an issue. She saw their ambition, their desire to control the wealth that had defined the Graves family for generations. "Things were simpler then," she muttered to herself. "But no more." Helen's mind raced. She had never been a woman to confront her children directly, never been the one to make waves. She had always believed in family, in the bond that should tie them together. But now she realized how wrong she had been. They had only ever cared for what she could provide them, what they could take from her. The next morning Helen made her call. She informed her children that she would be revising the will, making provisions for herself first and foremost. She knew they would come at her with a barrage of questions, with anger and resentment. But she also knew that she could no longer allow them to control her, to dictate the terms of her life. It was her turn to take charge. That afternoon, when the children arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. Jack was the first to speak, his face tight with barely contained frustration. "Mom, what is this about? Revising the will? Why now?" Helen stood tall, her posture unwavering. "Because it's time for me to protect what is mine. I have every right to do so." Sophie stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you saying you're going to cut us out of the inheritance?" Helen's gaze never wavered. I'm saying that I will decide how my estate is managed from now on. I won't be a pawn in your game anymore. Jack's jaw clenched, his temper flaring. You can't do this. You don't know what you're asking. We're your children, Mom. We deserve. You deserve nothing, Helen interrupted. You deserve nothing unless you earn it. And right now you have done nothing but show your greed. I won't stand by and let you ruin everything your father and I worked for. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Helen could see the shock on their faces, the realization that she was not the same woman they had known. She had changed and she was no longer willing to let them dictate the terms of her life. I will do what I must, she said, her voice steady and firm. And I will not be swayed. Jack's face contorted in rage, but he knew that there was no more room for negotiation. Helen had made her decision and she would stand by it no matter the cost. As the children left, their anger still simmering, Helen sat back in her chair. She had made her move. The battle for control had begun.
The days that followed Helen's bold decision were fraught with tension and uncertainty. The atmosphere in the mansion had shifted, and not for the better. It had once been a home filled with laughter, shared meals, and family gatherings. But now, every room seemed to carry an air of betrayal, like the walls themselves had turned against her. Helen, once the matriarch who held everything together with gentle hands, was now the target of a war she never asked for. A war fueled by greed, ambition, and the sharp sting of family betrayal. Helen had never expected her children to react this way, though in retrospect she should have. Jack and Sophie, her eldest children, had always been ambitious. They had always seen the mansion, the fortune, and everything she and Charles had worked for as their birthright. But she had never thought they would take it this far, would be willing to tear apart the family just to secure their place in the world. Yet here they were, pushing her into a corner, forcing her to defend what was hers. Her lawyer, Margaret Larson, had become her closest ally in these trying times. Margaret had been handling the Graves family estate for years, and her loyalty to Helen was unwavering. The night after the children's visit, Helen sat with Margaret in the study, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. It's going to be a fight, Helen, Margaret said, her tone grim. You've made your intentions clear, but Jack and Sophie won't go down without a struggle. They'll contest the will. They'll try to turn your own family against you. Helen's hands were folded tightly on the desk. She looked older, more fragile in that moment, but her eyes were sharp. I know what I'm up against. They've always thought of themselves as entitled. They've always believed that everything I have is theirs by right. But I won't give them what they want. Not without a fight. Margaret hesitated before continuing. There are ways to handle this. Legal ways. We can force them into a position where they'll have to back down, but it'll take time. And I need you to be prepared for the consequences. They'll go to any lengths to get what they want. And they won't care how much damage they cause along the way. Helen nodded slowly. I'm ready. They don't understand what they've unleashed. I've been silent for too long. Margaret studied her carefully. You'll have to be ruthless, Helen. There's no turning back now. They won't show mercy, so neither can you. The words stung, but Helen knew they were true. She had spent a lifetime building her family's wealth and legacy. It wasn't just about money, it was about respect, about honor. And now, with everything on the line, she was willing to do whatever it took to protect it. The next morning, Helen drafted the letter. It was short and to the point, informing her children that she would be revising the will with legal action to secure her estate. She arranged for the letter to be delivered by hand, knowing it would send shockwaves through her family. Jack and Sophie would understand exactly what this meant. By the time they received the letter, Helen had already begun to make arrangements with Margaret. They had contacted the family's private investigators to dig into Jack and Sophie's financials, to uncover any secrets they might be hiding. Helen wasn't naive enough to believe they hadn't already been making plans to challenge her. She had seen the way they looked at the estate, the way their eyes glinted when they spoke of their futures. The confrontation came sooner than expected. A few days later, Helen received an unexpected visit from Sophie. She had always been the more measured of her children, less overt in her ambition, but Helen could see the desperation in her eyes now. Sophie had always been the one to hide behind her charm, but that mask was slipping. "Mom, we need to talk," Sophie said, her voice strained as she entered the study. Her posture was stiff, her lips pressed together in a tight line. Helen didn't look up from the paper she was reading. "I'm listening." Sophie's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and confusion. "You're making a huge mistake, you know that, right? The will. This isn't what Dad would have wanted. He wanted us to have it all. Why are you doing this?" Helen finally looked up, her gaze cool but unwavering. "Your father may have wanted you to have everything, but he also wanted you to earn it. To work for it. You've done nothing but sit back and wait for me to die, Sophie. I won't stand by and let you squander everything your father built. If you want this estate, you'll have to fight for it. But I'm not giving it to you willingly." Sophie's face turned pale, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might break down in front of her mother. But instead, her expression hardened, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "Fine," Sophie said through gritted teeth. "If you want to make this a war, then we'll fight. But don't think for a second that you can win." Helen stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing. "I've already won, Sophie. The moment I made my decision, it was over. You just don't know it yet." Sophie's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You'll regret this." The words hung in the air long after Sophie had stormed out of the room. Helen felt a pang in her chest, regret perhaps, but not for the decision she had made. She had only ever wanted the best for her children, but they had pushed her to this point. She had to protect the legacy, and in doing so she would protect them from themselves. As the days passed, the tension in the mansion grew thicker. Jack's response came a week later in the form of a phone call. He had been quiet, calculating. But his words, when they finally came, were filled with anger. "You're making a mistake, Mom. You're pushing us too far. You think we're just going to sit back and let you rewrite everything? We'll see who has the last word." Helen felt the weight of his words, but it did nothing to shake her resolve. She knew the fight had only just begun, and she wasn't about to back down. Meanwhile, in the quiet corners of the mansion, the servants began to notice the shift in the household. There were whispered rumors among them of Helen's plans, of her resolve to keep the inheritance for herself. Some, like Mrs. Thompson, had been with the family for decades and understood the stakes. Others, like the new staff, were more intrigued than concerned. But Helen knew the whispers would spread, and that only added fuel to the fire. The mansion, once a symbol of family, now felt like a battlefield. Helen found herself retreating to her study more and more. It was where she could think, plan, and take stock of what was happening. She knew that there would be no way to avoid the inevitable showdown with her children. But she wasn't afraid. She had never been afraid to stand up for what was hers. She had been through too much, endured too many challenges in her life, to let her children tear apart everything she had built.
The days that followed Sophie's visit brought a new sense of clarity to Helen. She had been resolute before, but now, after the confrontation, she was more determined than ever to secure her position. The weight of the estate, the mansion, and everything it represented felt heavier on her shoulders with every passing day. But in that pressure she found the strength to push forward. It had taken years for Helen to build her life, piece by piece, through hard work and sacrifice. The mansion was not just a home, it was a legacy, one built on the sweat and tears of her late husband Charles, and her own undying commitment to their family's success. Now the inheritance was being threatened not by outsiders but by her own flesh and blood. The realization that her children would take everything she had built, without any regard for the sacrifice it took, stung more deeply than she could have imagined. Helen's strategy had already begun to unfold, and it was a slow, calculated game of chess. She would not fight this battle with anger or emotion. She would fight it with intellect, with timing, and, above all, with her own hidden power. Margaret Larson had been right. There was no turning back now. The family would not show mercy, and neither would she. But she would show them something they hadn't expected. A mother who, despite her age, had not lost her cunning or her ability to fight. It was a cold, crisp morning when the first surprise came. Helen had spent the previous day reviewing the family's finances. Charles had kept meticulous records, and discovered something unsettling. Jack, despite his outwardly successful business ventures, had accumulated a large amount of debt over the years. Sophie, on the other hand, had been using the estate's finances for her own lifestyle, dipping into the family accounts with little concern for the consequences. Neither of them had the means to take control of the mansion and its fortune. Helen's thoughts turned to a new weapon, one that she had been quietly preparing in the background. She called Margaret the next morning. "I've found something," Helen said, her voice steady but with a hint of satisfaction. "It's time to put the pressure on." Margaret's voice crackled through the phone, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "Their debts. Their irresponsibility. It's all right here in black and white. I'm going to use it against them. I'm going to make them realize that they've been living in my shadow, and it's time for me to step out of it. They won't get away with this." Margaret paused before responding. "Helen, are you sure about this? Exposing their financial problems might push them over the edge. They'll retaliate." "I'm not afraid of their retaliation," Helen replied, her voice hardening. "They've underestimated me for too long. Now they'll learn." Later that day, Helen arranged a family meeting. Jack and Sophie had both been summoned, and neither knew the full extent of what Helen had planned. As they entered the grand dining room, their faces were tight with anticipation and anger. Helen had already seated herself at the head of the table, her expression calm, but there was an unmistakable power in the way she sat. She was no longer the matriarch who could be pushed around. She was a woman in control. Jack stormed into the room first, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his expression sour. Sophie followed closely behind, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. Neither of them greeted Helen. They were beyond pleasantries now. "I hope you understand why we're here," Jack said, his tone laced with frustration. "You can't just make decisions like this, Mom. You're out of your depth." Sophie shot a glance at Jack, her eyes filled with anger, but she remained silent. Helen remained unfazed. "You've both made your feelings clear," she said, her voice low and controlled. "But it's time for you to hear what I've learned about your little games." Sophie's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "What are you talking about?" Helen didn't answer right away. Instead, she slid a folder across the table toward them, the papers inside neatly stacked and organized. Jack's gaze flickered to the folder, but he didn't touch it. Helen's eyes locked onto his. "Open it," she ordered, her tone sharp. Reluctantly, Jack pulled the folder toward him and began flipping through the documents. As he read, his face slowly drained of color. Sophie leaned over to get a glimpse of the papers. The realization hit her hard as well. These weren't just family papers. These were records of their financial troubles. The debt, the frivolous spending, and the way they had been using the family estate's resources to cover up their personal failings. Helen watched them both with cold eyes, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. "You didn't think I'd find out, did you? The debt. The bills. You've been using the family fortune like it was your own personal bank account. And I've let it slide until now." Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but Helen cut her off. "You're both going to have to come clean," Helen said. "You're going to acknowledge what you've done, or I'll make sure the entire town knows. Your debts will be public knowledge. Your manipulation of the estate's funds will be exposed. I'll take control and you'll have nothing." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack's hands clenched into fists on the table, but Helen didn't flinch. She had finally turned the tables. She was no longer the vulnerable mother, the soft touch. He was the one in control. "Mom, you can't do this," Jack finally said, his voice strained. This is too much." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Too much? You've been too much for years. You think you can just come into my home, my life, and take what you want? This ends now." Sophie stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're making a huge mistake, Mom," she said, her voice wavering. We didn't mean for it to get this far." Helen stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing as she gazed at her children. "You wanted everything, didn't you? The house, the fortune, the power. But you didn't want to earn it. You wanted to take it without lifting a finger. You wanted to ruin everything your father and I built." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time Helen saw a flicker of regret in their eyes. Sophie seemed almost broken, her shoulders slumped as she looked down at the table. Jack, on the other hand, was still seething, but there was no denying that the weight of his mother's words had hit him. "Here's how it's going to go," Helen continued. "You'll pay back what you owe and you'll work to rebuild the trust you've destroyed. I'm not asking you to be perfect. But I won't allow this family to be torn apart because of your selfishness. Sophie's voice was small now, filled with resignation. And what if we don't? What happens then? Helen smiled, a cold, determined smile. Then we'll see just how far you're willing to go to destroy everything you've ever wanted. But don't think for a second that I won't fight. You're not the only ones capable of playing dirty. Jack stood up, his chair clattering against the floor. You've won this round, Mom, he said, his voice laced with bitterness. But we're not done. This isn't over. Helen watched them both leave the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She had won the first battle. But the war was far from over.
Helen stood at the window of the mansion, her gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun dipped below the edge of the sprawling estate. The reflection in the glass showed an older woman, poised and unyielding, the weight of years and wisdom written across her face. It was a far cry from the helpless widow she had once been, a woman who had been ignored, exploited, and sidelined by her own children. Now, with the power firmly back in her hands, she felt the surge of control she had longed for, the satisfaction of turning the tables. But even as she basked in the triumph of her latest move, Helen knew the game was far from over. Jack and Sophie had retreated into their own worlds, furious but subdued. They had no choice but to comply, at least for now. Yet Helen understood their thirst for revenge. She knew they would strike back in time, that the real battle was still to come. She had dealt them a blow, but the war was far from finished. Over the next few days the mansion was quiet, almost too quiet. The servants moved through their duties with hushed voices, as if sensing the shift in power that had taken place. Helen had always been a strong presence in the house, but now there was an undercurrent of tension. She could feel it, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The atmosphere in the family was tense. Jack had become more reclusive, stewing in his anger behind closed doors. Sophie, on the other hand, had withdrawn completely, avoiding her mother at all costs. They were plotting something. Helen could feel it in the way they moved through the house, the whispered conversations in dark corners. They weren't ready to accept defeat. They would push back. As the days dragged on, Helen kept her eyes on them, waiting. She knew that in time they would make their move. But in the meantime she would bide her time, letting the pressure build. One mistake, one misstep, and she would strike again. The game was one of patience now, and Helen was a master. Then came the phone call. Helen had been sitting in her study, sipping a cup of tea, when the ringing broke through the silence. The voice on the other end was familiar. Margaret Larson. But this time her tone was different, filled with an urgent tension that immediately caught Helen's attention. "Helen, you need to be careful," Margaret warned, her voice low. "I've heard things. Jack and Sophie are making plans. They're not going to back down quietly." Helen's mind raced. She knew this day would come, but she hadn't expected it so soon. They had been quiet, too quiet. Perhaps they were testing her, waiting for her to let her guard down. But Margaret's warning made it clear. They were preparing to fight back. "Thank you for the warning, Margaret," Helen said, her voice steady but sharp. "I'll handle it. Don't worry." But as she hung up the phone, a sense of unease settled over her. She had been in control for so long, but now it felt as if the balance was shifting once again. Helen needed to act quickly to stay ahead of them. The next day she called a family meeting, this time without the usual coldness that had defined their previous encounters. She wanted to show her children that she was not just a woman seeking to hold on to power. She was the matriarch of this family, and she would fight for what was rightfully hers. Jack and Sophie walked into the room reluctantly, their faces still tight with anger but trying to mask their emotions. They were both on edge, clearly aware that they had been caught off guard by Helen's previous move. But now they were determined to regain what they felt was rightfully theirs. "Sit down," Helen said calmly, her voice carrying an authority that filled the room. "We need to talk." Jack crossed his arms over his chest, glaring at her. Sophie sat with her back straight, her lips pursed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Helen could see the cracks forming, the weakness that had always been there but was now beginning to surface. They were vulnerable, they just didn't know it yet. "I've given you both time to think," Helen began, her tone measured. "Time to reflect on your actions. But now the time for talking is over. I will not be pushed around in my own home. Jack opened his mouth to speak, but Helen held up a hand, silencing him. I'm not asking for your approval, Jack, she continued. You can be angry all you want, but the truth is you've both made a mess of things. The family finances, the inheritance, everything. And you've shown no respect for the legacy your father and I built. Sophie flinched at the mention of their father's name, but Helen didn't let the moment of weakness slip by. You both think you can just take what you want. But that's not how this works, Helen said, her voice growing firmer. The estate is mine. I've worked for it. I've earned it. And I will not let you destroy everything we've built for your own gain. Jack clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. Sophie's eyes darted around the room, her mind working through the options, but neither of them spoke. Helen could feel their uncertainty now. They were reeling from the shock of her power, but they wouldn't back down without a fight. This was just the calm before the storm. I've made arrangements, Helen continued, her gaze steady as she looked at her children. I'm putting everything in order. The will be updated to reflect my wishes, not yours. Sophie's face darkened and Jack's voice came out in a sharp, bitter tone. You think you can just do whatever you want? We'll fight you for this, Mom. You can't control everything forever. Helen's smile was cold, but there was a certain satisfaction in her expression. You're welcome to try. But remember, I have the upper hand now. I know what you've done. I know about the debts, about the hidden expenses. I'm not the fool you think I am. There was a long silence as Jack and Sophie exchanged glances, their anger simmering beneath the surface. They were out of their depth and they knew it. But Helen wasn't finished. I want you to understand something, she said, her tone calm but carrying an undercurrent of warning. This is not just about money. It's about respect. You've disrespected me, you've disrespected your father's legacy, and now you'll have to live with the consequences. Sophie's lips trembled and for the first time she seemed to break. We never meant for things to get like this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We just wanted what was ours. Helen's gaze softened for a brief moment, but her resolve remained unshaken. What's yours is nothing but an illusion, she replied. You've never earned it. I've worked for it all my life. And now I'll protect it no matter what. With those final words, Helen turned and left the room, leaving her children to stew in their anger and confusion. She knew they wouldn't give up easily, but she also knew they couldn't match her strength. She had played her cards well and now it was time to wait.
The days following the family meeting were like a powder keg, the tension thick in the mansion's halls, its walls heavy with unresolved conflict. Helen had made her declaration, and Jack and Sophie were not the types to back down quietly. They might have been rattled, but that only made them more dangerous. And as she retreated to her study, taking careful stock of the pieces she had moved on the board, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the precipice of something far greater than she had anticipated. Her resolve was ironclad. She had been through too much to lose everything now. But she had to tread carefully. She had set a plan in motion, a plan to reclaim what was rightfully hers, and though she was prepared to fight, she needed to play the long game. The mansion felt different now. It was no longer a home. It had become a battlefield, its grand walls echoing the silent fury of the two people who had once been her closest allies. But in their pursuit of power they had crossed a line. They had underestimated her and now they would pay the price. For the first time in weeks, Helen allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. Her fingers traced the edges of the desk, the smooth wood beneath them a familiar comfort. She could feel the weight of her past decisions, of the sacrifices she had made, the mistakes she had learned from. But there was one thing she had always known deep down: she could endure. She would survive. No matter what. It was then that the door to her study creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway. Margaret Larson, the one person who had remained loyal to Helen throughout it all. Margaret's face was drawn, her expression a mix of concern and caution. She had been the one person who had seen Helen not as a widow, not as a fragile old woman, but as a force to be reckoned with. And now more than ever Helen needed her. "Helen," Margaret said, her voice low, careful. "We need to talk." Helen looked up, meeting her gaze. She motioned for Margaret to come in, her voice steady. "What is it?" Margaret closed the door behind her, stepping further into the room. "It's Jack. He's doing something behind your back." I overheard him talking with someone about the estate. He's not planning to let you have it without a fight, Helen. He's making moves. Helen's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't show it. Instead, she remained calm, her mind already working through the possibilities. Jack had always been cunning, but he was reckless with his ambition. He didn't know how far Helen was willing to go to keep control. I've been waiting for this, Helen replied, her voice cold. What's he planning? Margaret hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder as though afraid someone might be listening. He's trying to get in touch with the board members. He's been using their frustrations with you to fuel his own cause. He's hoping they'll side with him when it comes time to take control of the estate. Helen's thoughts raced, but her face remained a mask of composure. This was exactly what she had feared. The fragile alliances Jack had built over the years, leveraging them to his advantage. But she knew the game now. She knew how to turn the tables. Let him, Helen said simply. Let him make his moves. I've already been 2 steps ahead of him. Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. What are you going to do? Helen smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was the smile of someone who had fought and survived. It was the smile of a woman who had nothing left to lose. I'll make sure Jack realizes that he's playing a dangerous game. One he can't win. The next few days were a blur of strategic moves. Helen spent her time digging through old family records, revisiting the agreements, and uncovering the secrets Jack and Sophie had buried over the years. There were debts hidden in plain sight, manipulations of the estate's finances that they had swept under the rug, and now, with the right information, Helen could expose it all. By the time the next family meeting rolled around, the air was thick with anticipation. The tension in the mansion was palpable, the very ground beneath Helen's feet seeming to hum with the knowledge that a storm was brewing. Helen had sent out invitations to the family and the board members Jack had been courting. The walls were about to close in on her children, and Helen had carefully crafted her counterattack. Jack and Sophie arrived, their faces a mixture of arrogance and caution. They had no idea what Helen had uncovered, no idea that the empire they were hoping to claim was about to collapse under the weight of their own deceit. The board members trickled in behind them, their expressions skeptical but curious. They had been fed lies, and now Helen would set the record straight. The meeting began, and the moment Helen stood to speak, the room fell silent. Her voice was calm, measured, but it carried with it the force of a woman who had nothing to lose. You've all been lied to, she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. My children, Jack and Sophie, have been using your good faith to manipulate the system, to secure what they believe is rightfully theirs. But I've spent my life building this family, this estate, and I won't let it be torn apart by greed and betrayal. Jack's face flushed with anger, but he didn't speak. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the room was beginning to tilt against him. He had underestimated Helen before, and now he realized it was too late to undo the damage. Helen continued, her voice unwavering. I have every document here. Every piece of evidence that proves you've been siphoning funds, forging signatures, and manipulating the estate for your own benefit. And you know what the worst part is? She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. You thought I didn't know. You thought you could do this behind my back. But I've been watching. I've been waiting. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. They had been on the edge of siding with Jack, but now they were starting to see the cracks in his facade. The truth was unraveling before them, and there was nowhere for Jack and Sophie to hide. Helen took a deep breath, her next words cutting through the silence. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm demanding respect. I've fought for everything I have. And I won't let it go, not to you, not to anyone. Jack opened his mouth to protest, but his words were lost in the weight of the truth. He was cornered, trapped in the web of lies he had spun. And as Helen looked around the room, she knew the power had shifted irrevocably back into her hands. Consider this your last warning, Helen said, her voice sharp as steel. Leave now before I make things worse for you. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in securing the future of this estate, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure that happens. The board members, now thoroughly shaken, stood up one by one, mumbling their apologies. Jack and Sophie remained seated, stunned into silence. They had lost, but they didn't know how to accept it. And just like that, the game was over. Helen had won. As she walked out of the meeting room, a wave of satisfaction washed over her. She had re-established control, but it wasn't just the estate that she had regained, it was her own power. No one would ever see her as weak again. She was the matriarch and no one would dare challenge her again.
The following days felt like a dream, a haze where Helen had to steady herself as the power she had reclaimed seeped back into her bones. The family was fractured. Jack and Sophie, who had once ruled the mansion with their deception and ambition, were now humiliated, their once unshakable grip on the estate slipping like sand through their fingers. The board members who had once been their silent allies were now distancing themselves, unsure of how to proceed in the wake of Helen's calculated revelation. But for Helen, the moment of victory was bittersweet. The throne she had reclaimed came at a great cost, the unraveling of her children's very souls. What had started as a small, calculated move had now become a full-scale war for the inheritance, a war that was not only about property but about pride, respect, and the truth. And in this game, Helen had learned that the truth was a far more potent weapon than money or power. In the silence of her study, Helen sat back, staring out of the window, where the view of the estate stretched out before her. The gardens, the grand pillars of the house, the well-kept lawns, it was all hers. It had always been hers. She had fought for it once before, and now she would have to do so again for her own legacy, for her family's legacy. But as the days passed, she felt the weight of her decisions. She had dealt the final blow to Jack and Sophie, but it didn't feel like the victory she had expected. The house, despite its grandness, felt empty now. She had reclaimed her authority, but it was as though the house itself was echoing with the remnants of the battles fought within its walls. The silence was deafening. It was Margaret Larson who came to her next, just when Helen thought she might finally catch her breath. "I overheard something," Margaret said, her voice low as she closed the door behind her. "It's not over yet." Helen raised an eyebrow, her pulse quickening with the instinct that something far worse was yet to come. "What do you mean?" Margaret lowered her gaze, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "It's Jack and Sophie. They've made an alliance with someone outside the family. They're planning something and it's more dangerous than anything they've done before. I think they've made a deal to push you out completely." Helen's heart sank as she processed the news. Her children had never been ones to accept defeat, but this was something else entirely. They were playing a deeper game, one that she wasn't sure she was ready for. "I need to know everything," Helen demanded, standing up sharply. "If they want a war, I'll give them one. But I need to be prepared." For the next few hours, Margaret shared everything she had overheard, every word she had caught, and it was worse than Helen could have imagined. Jack and Sophie weren't just plotting against her. They were making moves to completely erase her from the picture. They had found a powerful ally, someone with influence, and it was clear now that this wasn't just about the estate. It was about control, about rewriting history, and about breaking Helen's spirit. Helen paced the room, her thoughts racing. This was not how she had envisioned the next chapter of her life. She had worked so hard, fought so long, only to have her children betray her once again. But this time it was different. She wasn't just protecting her wealth, she was protecting everything she had built. Her legacy was on the line and no one, not even her own children, would take it from her. "I won't be erased," Helen said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of years of sacrifice and struggle. "They want to destroy me? Fine. But they don't know what they're dealing with." The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and secretive preparations. Helen's strategy was not only to fight back, but to expose everything, every last secret, every twisted plot. If Jack and Sophie wanted to turn the family upside down, she would be ready. She would dismantle their lives piece by piece, until they understood that she was the one who held the power. She began by taking a trip to the family lawyer, the one person who had always been in her corner. With his help, she reviewed every document she could get her hands on. The legal contracts, the financial records, even the old will her husband had left behind. She needed to ensure her position was airtight, that there were no cracks for Jack and Sophie to exploit. As she dug deeper, Helen uncovered something unexpected, a clause in her late husband's will that she had forgotten about. It wasn't something he had ever discussed, but there it was, hidden in the fine print. The clause stated that if the estate were ever to be contested by a family member, the individual who had been most loyal to the family would assume full control. It wasn't about money, it was about loyalty. Helen realized with a jolt that her path had just become much clearer. Jack and Sophie's alliance with outsiders could mean nothing. It was loyalty that mattered, and it was something they had never truly understood. Armed with this knowledge, Helen knew she had to act fast. She called an emergency family meeting, this time bringing in the trusted lawyer to ensure that everything was above board. The time had come to settle things once and for all. The family assembled, their faces masks of unease and anticipation. Jack and Sophie sat at the front, their expressions tense as they waited for Helen to make her move. But it was Helen who stood tall, her eyes sharp as she surveyed the room. "You think you can take everything from me," she began, her voice cool and controlled. "You think you can rewrite the rules, manipulate the situation to your advantage. But you've made one mistake. You've forgotten who built this empire." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Sophie's eyes blazed with fury. "You're nothing but a stubborn old woman," Sophie spat. "This estate is ours now. You had your time. It's over." Helen's lips curled into a cold smile. "Oh, it's far from over," she said. "In fact, this is just the beginning." She motioned for the lawyer to step forward. "I've uncovered a clause in your father's will. A clause that you've both conveniently overlooked. It's not about money, it's about loyalty. And you, Jack, you, Sophie, you've betrayed the very thing that has always held this family together. And that, my children, will be your undoing." The room fell silent. Helen's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Jack's face turned pale while Sophie's eyes widened with disbelief. They had underestimated Helen just as they had done for years. But now they understood. It was Helen who held the final card. "I'm not just a widow," Helen continued, her voice now laced with a quiet power. "I am the matriarch of this family. And I will not be pushed aside. I will not be erased." Helen's words cut through the tension like a knife. She had won. The family that had once plotted against her now stood on the edge of defeat, and they knew it.
The weeks following the family meeting were marked by an eerie silence. Helen had made her move, but the full repercussions of her actions were still unfolding. Jack and Sophie, who had once stood so firmly against her, were now weak, their power crumbling before their eyes. They had underestimated the depths of their mother's resolve, and now they were paying the price. Helen sat in the grand sitting room of the mansion, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The large windows offered a view of the sprawling estate, but her gaze was inward, lost in thought. The mansion, once a symbol of her family's wealth and power, now felt like a prison. A place she had built and lived in for so long, but now it no longer felt like home. It felt cold, empty, and distant. But she could not afford to be sentimental. The game was still in play, and Helen had learned long ago that sentimentality had no place in this world. The stakes were too high and she was too close to the end to back down now. The lawyer had assured her that everything was in order. The clause in her late husband's will was legally binding, and with the family's betrayal exposed, the power was now hers to wield. But Helen knew that the final confrontation was still to come. Jack and Sophie would not go down without a fight, and she needed to be ready. The door to the sitting room creaked open, and in walked Margaret Larson. The woman had been a loyal servant for years, and Helen had come to trust her in ways she had never trusted anyone else. Margaret's face was pale, her eyes filled with concern. "Helen," Margaret said, her voice soft but urgent. "There's something you need to know." Helen straightened in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Margaret hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if ensuring they were alone. "It's Jack and Sophie. They've found a way to undermine your control. They've been working with the board members again, trying to sway them to their side. They want to use the company's finances to fight you in court. It's not over yet." Helen's chest tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was not the first time her children had resorted to dirty tricks. She had always known that the fight for the estate wouldn't be easy, but she had hoped that the weight of the truth would be enough to crush their ambitions. "Do they think they can take this from me?" Helen asked, her voice cold. "Do they really believe they can outmaneuver me?" Margaret nodded gravely. "They're desperate, Helen. They'll do anything." Helen's mind began to race. She had come so far, had fought so long for this moment of victory, only to have it threatened by her own blood. She had to act quickly. She had to end this once and for all. "We need to gather the support we need," Helen said, her tone steely. "Contact the other board members. I want to make sure they know where their loyalties lie. We'll stop them from making any moves. And if they try anything, we'll be ready." Helen's voice was firm, but inside she could feel the weight of the decision she was about to make. She had fought her entire life for this power, this estate, and she would not let her children take it from her. Not now. Not after everything. Margaret nodded and left the room to do Helen's bidding. Helen, meanwhile, stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the estate. The house had once been a symbol of love, a place where her family had gathered, where they had shared memories and dreams. But now it was a battleground, a place where the ghosts of her past haunted every corner. Her mind drifted back to the early days when she and her husband had first moved into the house, when the future had seemed bright and everything had felt possible. She had built this empire from the ground up, and now it was slipping through her fingers. But not without a fight. No. She would reclaim what was rightfully hers. The following days were filled with frantic phone calls, urgent meetings, and secretive discussions. Helen's plan was simple: to expose her children's treachery and rally the support of the people who mattered most. The board members would be her weapon, and with their loyalty she would secure her future once again. The final showdown came sooner than she expected. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Helen walked into the courtroom with a sense of calm resolve. Her children sat across from her, their faces masks of defiance, but Helen could see the fear in their eyes. They knew they had lost. They just didn't know how much. The lawyer who had helped Helen prepare for this day stood by her side, a calm figure of professionalism in contrast to the tension in the room. Helen had made sure that the evidence of Jack and Sophie's betrayal was airtight. The legal documents, the recordings, the testimony from those who had seen the manipulations firsthand, it was all in her favor. As the proceedings began, Helen's lawyer presented the case. The betrayal, the manipulation, the attempt to seize control of the estate, it was all laid bare for the court to see. Jack and Sophie tried to protest, to shift blame, but their lies were transparent, their defenses weak. And as the minutes dragged on, it became clear that Helen had won. The court ruled in her favor, and with it her children's claim to the estate was nullified. Helen sat back in her chair, a quiet triumph in her chest. She had done it. She had reclaimed her power, her estate, and her legacy. But as the ruling was read, she felt a strange sense of emptiness. It wasn't the victory she had imagined. There was no joy in it, only the cold satisfaction of justice. As the courtroom emptied, Helen turned to leave, her heart heavy with the weight of her actions. She had fought for her family, for her inheritance, for her place in this world. But in the end it had all come at a cost. The bonds of blood had been broken, and what remained was only the hollow echo of what had once been. Walking back to her car, Helen felt the years of emotional stress and betrayal weigh heavily on her. She had won the war, but at what cost? Her children, her family, everything she had once held dear, was lost. In her quest for justice, she had become something she never wanted to be: alone. The mansion awaited her, empty and cold, but Helen knew it was where she belonged. It was her home, her legacy. And though the family that had once filled its halls was now gone, the mansion would always be there, standing as a silent testament to the price of power, greed, and betrayal. The story of Helen and her family reflects the profound consequences of betrayal, greed, and the pursuit of power. Through her struggle to regain control, Helen's journey serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of respecting familial bonds, the destructive nature of exploitation, and the toll of emotional neglect. At the heart of this tale is the question of legacy: what truly matters in life. While Helen's victory over her children may seem like a triumph of justice, it comes at the cost of broken relationships and a hollow victory. This story urges us to reflect on the value of compassion, trust, and the fragility of human connections. It teaches us that no amount of wealth or power can replace the genuine bonds of love and respect that truly define a family. As we move forward, let us prioritize empathy over greed, connection over conquest, and understanding over division. Only then can we hope to build lasting legacies that reflect the best of what it means to be human.